What is also coming with 10.1.5 was the interview with our Dragonflight's game director Ion Hazzikostas. What was interesting about this interview was the thought process and the ideas from Blizzard about a few features, perhaps also some changes not very well welcomed by the player base, like for example some comments about where did the rogue rework supposed to come in this patch go? What about the change to the health increase of the players, and in exchange increasing the damage taken of the players if they are happy with this change? What about the change of the removal of the affix of the season for the rotating dungeons? How about the loot? Are they happy with how fast have we been gearing up this season, and if we can expect this level of gearing up speed in the next season as well? Across these answers, I would like to start with the more sad one, which is the one about rogues. Because, of course, rogues had been led to believe that a big rework was coming, just like it is for mages and for Holy Paladin, except it never came. I find it a bit sad because the answer of Ion is, well, that's not gonna happen in 10.1.5 at this point, in case it wasn't clear. That's the entire point. They weren't clear. They did not communicate properly that this rework was going to be delayed. As Ion himself says, we are planning it in a later patch coming up soon. So my 2 cents are on 10.1.7, which is coming soon. However, this was not really communicated, and Ion keeps saying we ask the community's patience and understanding as we want to be transparent and try to communicate upfront about what our plans are. But these plans can change all of a sudden. It would have been good still if these change of plans were to be communicated to the players, because otherwise you're left in a situation where those poor rogues are left every week huffing copium and refreshing the pages of the balance tuning of 10.1.5, hoping to read something down the rogue tag, and every time they are disappointed. Whereas if they were just being told at the start that the rogue rework was going to be delayed, it would have stung a bit, it would have burned them a little bit inside, but at least now they could put themselves at peace and know that they had to wait a little bit more for the rework, something that didn't happen in 10.1.5. So that's the first bit about the lack of the rogue rework that didn't come in this patch. It should have still been announced and should have still been made known to the rogue players that it was being delayed. Then we have an answer which is frankly a little bit worrying and scary, which is the question about how do you feel about the additional 25% health increase to the players and in return the enemies doing 25% more damage. Most of this answer is essentially a venture into an alternate dimension, a reality that doesn't exist. Ion is pointing out that they increase the player power, the defensiveness and the healing available to players through the new talent system by allowing multiple hybrid specs, tank specs and DPS specs to have access to healing or defensive abilities that they otherwise would not have been able to reach in previous versions of the game, that they thought before Dragonflight launched that they needed to increase the health of the players and the damage taken by players by upwards of 60 or even 70%. That's how much they wanted to go. But they got scared. They thought the number was far too big and far too drastic to launch before the release of the expansion, so they let it sit for a bit. And then they implemented it in a smaller capacity in Season 2 by increasing the health and damage taken by 25%. And it feels like he's talking mostly about the raid. You know, he says, in terms of how the tier has played out overall, I think healing and HPS and the change to health and damage intake seems to be in a healthier place, when it is actually not. It is in the raid, it has improved in the raid, but it has not in Mythic Plus. There is also the last part, which is a little bit scary, where he says that they are going to be keeping an eye out on player numbers and on players' feedback, and he says it's always telling when healers are telling us and the healer influencers are telling us and making videos saying, hey, we think healing is too powerful right now. When's the last time someone has made a video like this? And if they did, why are they not in jail? Who has ever pointed out that healing was too strong and too powerful right now in Dragonflight? That was perhaps not the type of example you should have given, because that might give players the wrong impression. The idea that you actually think healing is in a powerful spot right now. That was a little bit of a weird answer across the board from Ion and makes it a little bit scary thinking about Season 3 if they think that we still need to increase the health and the damage taken of the players because every spec now has more defensive and more ways to survive, so they want to make spike damage numbers even higher. That's not a place I want to see Mythic Plus heading towards in Season 3, let's just say that. Then we have the question about gear and gear acquisition, and the answer is kind of interesting because the question is about how do you feel the upgrade system, the new Season 2 upgrade system went, as well as why did you include the myth track, the extra item level track going up to 447 in 10.1.5. So the general answer is that they are happy that the system is giving much more agency to each players, much more ways to increase your gear and feel like you can continue to progress. He mentions that they are adding the myth track because they realized, much like many players realized, that the mythic raiding gear from the first 4 bosses or so was being made useless, or at a very, very low power level because it was dropping at 441 item level, which is the same item level as heroic. So it doesn't feel good to kill a boss in heroic and then go back up in mythic and get basically the same item level. You're just not spending flight stones and aspect crests to upgrade it, but besides that, it still caps at 441. So the myth track was added to give more value to the mythic raid, which is a cool addition. I'm still a little bit worried about how fast, about how quick we were able to become powerful. I agree with what he's pointing out, that giving more gearing agency to the players is very good, but I'm sorry to say, because it doesn't help us players, but we gear too fast. We just get way too much item level way too early. It makes it much harder also to balance raid bosses. Based on that item level increase spike we can get much earlier. So I do feel like we should probably tone down the amount of gear we can upgrade every week. At the very least in the first, 2 to 3 weeks. Maybe slow it down a little bit just so you don't jump 10 item levels every week, which is a little bit too much, I think. Even though the upgrade system is better in every way compared to the Valor system we had in the past, I still think it might have gotten out to be a little bit too fast in the first few weeks of the season. Then we have a question about the affixes, about the removal of some of the now dead affixes like Quaking and Explosive, as well as the introduction of Afflicted, Incorporeal and Entangling. In general, he says Incorporeal is A-OK, so is Entangling. However, Afflicted will likely see more iterations after this season is over. However, there is an entire sentence that makes me a little bit depressed. Ion is saying, it is deliberate that from week to week the affixes may have more of a burden or more of a direct impact on certain specs or certain classes more than others. Part of the original design and philosophy of affixes going back all the way from Legion was to have a little bit of a role specificity on them. So one week this affix is going to be meant to impact ranged players, and then this other week is going to be melee players, and then tank players and healers or whatever else. Just so that your group from week to week will get to regularly run dungeons together with some variety of the experience in the Mythic Plus key. This is the problem that we have mentioned now multiple times, is that at the moment the majority of the affixes are going to be negatively impacting the healer and not much else. As we mentioned multiple times, if the DPS player fails and gets hit by Spiteful, the healer has to heal. If the DPS player fails and gets too many stack of Bursting, the healer has to heal. If the DPS player fails and they don't focus target properly and you end up having a couple of mobs with tons of bolstering stacks, the healer has to heal more. So even with this statement from Ion doesn't actually reflect on reality, as at the moment there are far too many affixes pointing out specifically at healers. There is a decent amount of affixes, a fair amount of affixes, mostly focused on the tank, and then just way too few affixes punishing the DPS, which is not something that unfortunately it seems like Ion is recognizing in this answer. Some other answers are the classic tried and true lawyer speak of Ion, pointing out that, oh, we recognize that in the PUG world, some affixes may make some classes mandatory or others totally undesirable. That's problematic and something we want to avoid. If you wanted to avoid that, you could have stopped having a bunch of dungeons giving out magic debuffs on multiple players, which can only be dealt with Mass Dispel. Because, flash news, there's only one class that can Mass Dispel. For example, we are now closing the bit of the interview with Ion with a chaotic answer, at least from my point of view. It's the answer about what if augmentation goes well? You know, what if the spec is enjoyed? What if it finds a spot in the meta? Would we be considering having more support specs in the future? The TLDR of Ion is that yes, although it would have to be by adding a brand new one, not like some players keep asking about turning certain specs into different ones, like let's have Enhancement Shaman become a tank, you know, let's have Discipline Priest turn into a support spec. The answer from Ion is, if we might think about adding a support spec, it will have to be a brand new one. So either coming from a brand new class or an extra spec to an already existing class. I'm saying chaotic answer because I think this will make things very complicated in terms of balancing, in terms of fixing the compositions of a raid and of Mythic Plus comps, for example, with these type of support specs. Talking about difficult comp and difficult ways to make everything mesh together, we have the question about the compositions, especially in the raid, when it comes to mandatory spec, to raid locked specs, to must-have specs. Because things are starting to get quite tight, you know? With the addition of the Paladin's second aura, Retribution aura, which now makes it worth to run in a raid, we are in a situation where you want one Paladin for Devotion aura, one Paladin for Ret aura, you then want a Rogue for Atrophic Poison, you want Priest for Stamina, you want Mage for Intellect, you want Warrior for Battle Shout, you also want at the very least one Monk, and at the very least one Demon Hunter for the two respective debuffs, you then want Warlock for Healthstones and for, you know, Gateway and Portals and whatnot, and then you want Druid for Mark of the Wild. That's 10. If we are adding Augmentation Evoker, which as it is likely it might be somewhat mandatory, especially in the raid, you are now up to 11 specs. 11 specs or classes locked in a 20 mythic raid comp. You know, this starts to make the options in the rest of your picks quite tight, quite limited. And this isn't even to start increasing this number of mandatory picks with things like Enhancement Shaman for Wind Fury, which would bring up your numbers to 12. Not to mention adding at the very least a second pick of the two strongest DPS specs. So if Mage and Warlock are the best ones, then the number of mandatory specs basically goes from 12 to 14 to 15, because you also want the best specs. So the specs that don't bring anything special, like Hunters, like DKs, and like Shamans outside of enhancement, would start to feel quite cramped, would start to feel quite limited in the options they have to play in the raid. The answer from Ion is an old school classic lawyer speak. It's really perfect because it's a full set of words without actually meaning anything. It's something that we are certainly mindful to pay attention to. Our goal for Mythic Raiding is for the best composition, the optimal composition, the ones that we see at the high end, to have one of every class out of the 20 slots available. When we are seeing a deviation from that, we are going to look at why and ask what we can do to adjust and to change it. We have tried to be resistant to every class bringing a unique mandatory buff that rigidly forces itself to be a part of the raid. Now, this makes no sense since effectively every single class now has a mandatory buff that they can bring, with the exception of DK and Hunters, and possibly Shamans without Wind Fury. So at that point it makes it quite unfair for those specs to not have anything. And then Ion makes the example of course you want a Death Knight somewhere for grips, because that is just such a valuable tool to have over the course of a raid. How often did we need grip in Aberrus? How often was having multiple DKs for gripping mobs mandatory or super valuable in Aberrus, to the point where DK was a default staple pick? Of course, nowhere even remotely close as specs with actual mandatory buffs. And that's the problem I keep having with this type of mandatory buff issue. And I don't even play Death Knight. I don't even play Hunter or Shaman yet. I would still like to see more options, more variety for these picks to be available, for giving every class the same chance at being viable in the raid. That's something I would like to see. Doesn't seem like it's going to happen in the near future, but one can always hope. So this was the entire list of the more interesting answers given by Ion for the upcoming 10.1.5 patch, and some of the changes they Blizzard had or didn't have before this patch came out, and what they think about doing as far as changes go in the near future. That is all that we have for today. Some answers were somewhat disappointing, somewhat not what I wanted to hear, but at the very least we have gotten some insight, some insider look on the thought process of the developers when it comes to certain features in this game, which is still better than having none at all. So I'm trying to look at things from the glass half full perspective, much like rogues have to do, waiting a couple more months for the rework. Now, with this out of the way, we are done for today. This has gone on for long enough. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help, which can also be given completely for free. Liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself, are still fine enough ways to show your support. With this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, how can you say our goal isn't to have every class with a mandatory buff if you gave 9 out of 12 classes a mandatory buff?